So bringing it back to the world of golf. So often, it's obviously not as physically exerting as a marathon or some of the other sports, but when you're in high level tournament play or when you're really engrossed in something where the stakes are high, you get that mental fatigue where having to focus over each one of the shots, 60 or 70 shots, whatever it is that you're focusing on. How does that relate to just the mental fatigue aspect? Maybe separating the physical fatigue, which may not be as important in something as golf, but it's the mental fatigue of going through that procedural focus each time, where maybe things aren't going your way and you start getting sloppy in your thinking, or you just get mentally tired because you're focusing so hard, or worse yet, there's external things that are stealing your attention, which is stealing your energy from being able to focus. What's your experience, your expertise on the mental fatigue aspect of
Yeah,
it?
that's a great point. I will say, just as an aside, beginning that, a 3-day golf tournament is a physical challenge, right? And, going back, like Tiger Woods was the revolution, right? Like, oh, wait, maybe we should be in the gym, Oh,
Actually working out.
yeah. And so I think there's definitely truth to that if you want to perform well over a long period of time, the physical side is real, but the mental side is also important. And that's been, I would say, in the last 10 years in the sports science world, one of the big emerging trends has been the study of mental fatigue and the recognition that it's a real distinct thing that's distinct from physical fatigue. And so there have been a lot of studies looking at protocols where it's like you put someone in front of a computer screen and ask them to do a pretty simple task, but one that requires sustained attention. So it might be that, letters or numbers or arrows are flashing on the screen and you have to press one button or another button depending on which number it is, and you have to press it as quickly as possible. So it's not hard. Like an 8-year-old could do this task, but to do it as fast as possible, you're really focusing on it. And you do that for, let's say, 90 minutes or 2 hours. And then you go out and do a physical task. Let's say in some of these studies, it's just like you get on a bike and you have to ride as hard as you can for 10 minutes or whatever and see how well you do. And you compare that to a control group that sat in front of the screen for exactly the same amount of time, but instead of having to sustain attention, they're just watching a documentary or something like that. And you find that there is an enormous performance decrement for people who've had to sustain attention. They're mentally fatigued, and so they can no longer push themselves as hard. And so, in fact, in some of the studies, the effect of 90 minutes of mentally fatiguing tasks was as big as the negative effect of doing 100 drop jumps. So you can smash your legs or you can smash your mind, and either way, you were getting 15% slower on the cycling trial that came right after. So these kinds of studies generated that first study was like 2009 or something. So it's been actually more like 15 years. All of a sudden, a lot of pro athletes, a lot of pro sports teams suddenly were like, oh crap, we need to think about mental fatigue. We need to think about how we protect our athletes from it and how we minimize it. And so, golf is a classic illustration of mental fatigue. And when they do these mental fatigue studies, so you can see a drop in physical performance, you can also see a drop in decision making, drop in execution speed, but also in there have been studies with simulated soccer games where you find that, when they're mentally fatigued, players run less, they're less likely to be in the right position. But also you put them in a virtual reality situation where it's all of a sudden it's a freeze. They have to make a decision, shoot, pass, dribble. They take longer to make the decision and they're more likely to make the wrong decision when they're mentally fatigued. And so this is on day 3 of a tournament or, on the 18th hole or whatever, this is exactly what you're fighting against, which is that your mind is tired and it's starting to want to default to the simplest option, to just do what comes to mind first, not to think through the options, and you're feeling physically tired. So there's a couple of things to think about here. One is that you want to try and avoid mental fatigue when possible. So you want to think about eliminating, in the context of competition, you want to think about eliminating factors like you mentioned, external factors, things that may be pulling your mind away, things that may, I'm a journalist, so I hate saying this, but it's like maybe right before a match, you don't want to do a long interview with a journalist where you're concerned about how you're coming off. You're trying to present a good impression. You're using up your mental energy. You want to have a simple, familiar routine before a match. There are also ways of training mental fatigue. There are ways of explicitly training mental fatigue where you can just sit in front of a computer screen and do these mentally fatiguing tasks. I don't think that's a really a good use of time for most people. I think you get by doing physical training, you're also going back to what you said at the beginning about training for an Ironman. You're training your mind to train your body. That's true. And so as a result, when you're training your body, you are training your mind. And there's lots of research showing that trained athletes have better resistance to mental fatigue than the average person. And one thing that There's one of the researchers who's in that area. I asked him, like, what's your actual advice to people? You do all these studies where people sit in front of computers. Is that what people should be doing? And he was like, I'm not sure. These are, again, proof of principle, but in the real world, one of the things he tells athletes is like, there will be times when you're training and the situation is not optimal. You were up last night with a sick kid, or your flight was delayed, you're a little jet lagged for whatever reason. You're now here doing in this training session that you wanted to do, that you really hoped was going to be good. Now you're doing it in suboptimal conditions. Well, one way to think about that is to say, all right, that's okay. Maybe I'm not going to perform as well in this training session as I might have if I was fresh, but this is a good chance to practice when I'm mentally fatigued, to practice maintaining focus, sustaining attention, clearing my mind, pushing through fatigue, and still performing as best I can. Because realistically, in the competitive setting, you are going to face those situations.
I love that so much. I think that's so wise, where it's you're reframing what the actual goal of that workout session or that practice session actually is. You're not trying to do a personal best on the elliptical or whatever you're training for, but you realize that you're like, whoa, I'm actually now get a wonderful opportunity to train my mental focus, my ability that you're putting yourself in a situation that it may be optimal if you're looking from a physical standpoint, but it's hyper optimal if you're looking on how to get stronger mentally. And it's just a simple reframing your mind that, like, okay, instead of blaming and becoming a victim that I didn't get enough sleep, I didn't, whatever it might be, you're actually awesome. I get to actually practice being mentally strong. Amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all going to be in those situations, so reframing it makes it feel better, and also it maybe motivates you to push through instead of just sort of giving up on the workout, and to get something out of it.
Okay, so in that study, I'm just kind of curious, the control group versus the group that was doing that simple task. The more that they did that task, did they find that it had less of an impact when they got back on the 10-minute exertion of energy? Like, did they find that was able to, they were able to get mentally stronger, if you will, the more that they did that task and the more they put themselves in that situation? Is that what's happening with the professional athlete? Basically, the more that they're in tournament play and in high pressure situations, the more comfortable they are in those situations?
So certainly, so in the experimental context, what they can find is, yeah, you spend 8 weeks, 3, 4, or 5 times a week sitting in front of the computer doing the task. Then you do an actual test where it's like mental fatigue followed by physical challenge or followed by some kind of performance test. They're better at maintaining their performance despite mental fatigue. So you can train this. And the way some athletes have operationalized this is to say, look, I don't have time to spend 90 minutes a day sitting in front of a computer playing, something that's even more boring than tic-tac-toe, but maybe we can incorporate it into a workout. So there was a guy working with the Danish Olympic Committee who had a few of their teams doing things like they'd be doing gym workouts, and on the rest between sets, instead of just sitting around, they would do a set of exercise. Then they'd go over to an iPad and do a set of during the rest. They'd be doing these sort of mentally fatiguing computer games. So there's ways of integrating it into the training in a way that's more time efficient and kind of less onerous. I would argue that I wouldn't give a blanket recommendation that everyone should be doing mental fatigue training, but rather they should be aware of this as a skill that they want to cultivate. Because if you are training, if let's say you're playing 72 holes of golf every day, or like, I don't know how golfers train, but or hitting however many buckets of balls at the range, that requires focus.